Real-world locations can make for memorable moments in fiction. As anyone who's ever watched a disaster movie knows, a recognisable landmark can ground the audience in a familiar reality, generate spectacle, and elicit emotion. Say you're designing a new first-person shooter. Perhaps, in an attempt to create a powerful moment, you take a location that symbolises peace and place it in the middle of a war zone, the scene of a set-piece firefight. On release it goes down well, but then one day, you wake up to the news that the custodians of the building you recreated have publicly accused you of sacrilege. How would you react? This is what happened in 2007, when the clergy of a British cathedral waged a PR war against one of the titans of the games industry. Resistance: Fall of Man was a first-person shooter set in an alternate 1950s, after an unstoppable alien virus sweeps across Eurasia, posing an existential threat that prevents the Second World War. In all of Europe, only pockets of Britain have held out against the Chimera menace. Developed by Ratchet & Clank studio Insomniac Games and published by Sony, the game was a highlight of the PS3 launch lineup, becoming the first title on the platform to sell 1 million copies. But several months after release, the companies involved encountered resistance of a different kind. The game had upset some residents of Manchester, England, and not just because it placed the city on Merseyside. The 8th level of the campaign featured an ambush inside the city's cathedral, depicted in the game as an abandoned makeshift hospital. Manchester's clergy, arguing that the scene was an act of virtual desecration, unleashed a barrage of criticism of the game and its publisher. What caused such offence? Which side came out on top? And what's the story behind the level's creation? From the initial idea to the construction of the Manchester level, most of the work that went into Resistance's Cathedral can be credited to one man.
I'm Stephen Ratter. I've been an environment artist for 25 years, and I've worked on the first 3 Medal of Honor games, the very first Call of Duty, and the Resistance titles.
Upon joining Insomniac, Stephen asked if he might embark upon a project that he'd previously done for Call of Duty.
It wasn't long before I gave my recommendation to the art director that if they were going to embark on such a huge game, their texture library needed a serious and authentic base of images. After looking over design docs and talking to designers, I started formulating rough ideas of where some of the locations might be around England, and I planned the trip accordingly to where the location shoots would happen. My goal here was to take architectural reference as well as photos that could be manipulated and used for our game. I had complete freedom in this endeavor.
He was particularly intent upon avoiding scenes that players had seen before.
There was a deliberate attempt to get away from the same old thing of blowing up Big Ben or defending Buckingham Palace. I wanted to scratch a little deeper and show some of the other locations and sides of England that popular media maybe hadn't necessarily showcased before.
Over the course of 2 weeks, travelling solo, Stephen crossed the length and breadth of England.
I did all the driving myself in a rented car, and I got lost plenty of times. But in that time, I would set out to a city and walk around, getting the lay of the land, so to speak, and start shooting photos early in the morning all the way until sunset. I imagined where levels could take place, and I tried to capture iconic buildings, interesting natural features, as well as signage and details that were specifically British.
During his visit to Manchester, he collected a broad range of reference material: factories, old buildings, and the city's cathedral. Nothing had been prearranged, but on the day of his visit he explained to the staff that he was working on recreating the cathedral for a video game.
I explained that it was a marvelous jewel, a truly calming and sacred place, and it was important that it was represented as a landmark of Manchester. They told me to take as many pictures as I wanted, and I could spend as much time there as I needed.
The photos he brought back were used to produce textures, serving also as reference for Stephen as he built the level in the engine. Game and reality had some differences.
I tried to capture all of the different elements of it. The marble floor, the design of the pillars, the center choir loft, and the upper parts of the rafters and the windows. The side altars and their statuary just couldn't be included. We neither had the time, the manpower, or frankly the polys to create all of it.
Nevertheless, the building's officials gave the developers credit for the fidelity of their reproduction. Here's the Subdean Reverend Canon Paul Denby speaking on NPR.
Well, in terms of the ability of electronics, it's photorealistic. I think it's amazing.
Let's put this into a wider context. When Resistance was released in 2007, action amidst Christian architecture was already a familiar shooter trope. The buildings depicted were often fictional, sometimes real, and seldom, if ever, controversial. But there's more to Resistance's use of the Cathedral than an FPS cliché. Throughout history's times of war, religious buildings have been turned into both field hospitals and battlegrounds, their sanctity not always respected in the chaos of war. In World War II, churches were often targets of indiscriminate destruction, including Manchester Cathedral itself, which sustained catastrophic damage in the Blitz. Events like this have happened repeatedly in wartime, a history the game evokes. Far from merely using it as an aesthetically interesting combat arena, Retter was keen to present the cathedral thoughtfully and respectfully.
Churches and cathedrals can be many things to many people, and I never set out to deliberately make a sacrilegious statement. If anything, I wanted a player to possibly consider why we hold one building sacred and not another. In our game, I wanted the Manchester Cathedral to be a hospital and a place of refuge, this grand, beautiful testament to not only faith, but to providing people with solace, with healing, with sanctuary and shelter. And yet, in Resistance, the ravaging hordes of aliens had breached the defenses of this safe haven, and you were now to be fighting for not only an institution or a religion, but a personal ideal.
Though the damaged cathedral is the site of a battle, its presence is intended to inspire reflection. The building's symbolism is respected, even highlighted, and after the battle is over, the player can linger and explore the space, which, writer Ian Bogost suggested, made this chapter the most meaningful moment in the game.
Manchester Cathedral was ransacked during the English Civil War in 1649, half destroyed by German bombs in 1940, and bombed by the Irish Republican Army in 1996. It survived all these attacks. Its patrons rebuilt it. And it stands still today. Resistance adds a fictional homage to the church's resolve, this time in an alternate history fraught by an enemy that neither understands nor cares for human practices like religion. And it survives this as well. The Church of England sees their cathedral's presence in Resistance only as a sordid juxtaposition, the sanctity of worship set against the profanity of violence. But when viewed in the context of the game's fiction, the cathedral serves a purpose in the game consonant with its role in the world, that of reprieve for the weary and steadfastness in the face of devastation.
A sentiment echoed by Stephen Ratter.
Through an alien invasion, bombings, and enemy occupation, that wonderful, tough old monument was still standing, and quite proudly. And it was through the efforts and the lives of brave soldiers that it was defended, and quite frankly, I think that idea is British to the core.
The controversy began 2.5 months after the game's European release, when a link to a YouTube video circulated among Cathedral staff. The response was immediate. The Bishop of Manchester denounced the game in the press only hours after first hearing about it. The Cathedral's Dean, the Very Reverend Rogers Govender, took centre stage in the protest, making repeated appearances in the media and sending a letter to Sony with the threat of legal action.
You will know that about 3 years ago, our cathedral was virtually desecrated by the producers of a very, very violent computer game. And we decided to challenge them in the public sphere and take a stand.
Officials made 3 demands of the publisher.
Basically, we're drawing their attention to the irresponsible way in which they've had this manufactured, using the cathedral in a most unfortunate way. And we've said to them that we would prefer them to withdraw the game immediately. Secondly, to basically ask them to apologise for using the building without permission, because what they've done is rather rude and discourteous, to say the least. And then we believe that they should give a substantial donation that could be used to continue the resisting of gun crime in our city and generally violence in our area.
The developers, deep into production on Resistance 2, were taken aback.
When we at Insomniac first heard of the kerfuffle that was raised by the Church of England, we were surprised. We never intended this to offend anyone.
Sony made some short statements and met with Cathedral representatives, but for the most part they waited the controversy out.
The game was certainly not coming off the shelves. People talked about it, there was discussion, but it was not a major crisis that needed to be spun in any way or damage controlled. And if I remember correctly, Sony and Insomniac kind of stayed the course. They were sympathetic, but yes, we had moved on to the next game.
For a week, Cathedral officials continued to spin the story, giving the media something different to write about every day and keeping the pressure on Sony. This was no amateur exercise. It was a smart, well-organised public relations campaign. Cathedral officials were making daily appearances on television, radio, and in newspapers, and with Sony remaining quiet, most of the coverage was necessarily one-sided. For all the Cathedral's antiquity, they could clearly play better PR. It didn't help that Sony initially denied that Manchester Cathedral was in the game, saying the building was intended to be a generic old church, a statement that came as a surprise to Stephen and others who worked on it. One sore point for the clergy was Manchester's high level of gun-related violence. In the 1990s, the city had picked up the nickname Gunchester, and though by 2007, violent crime had begun to fall, the city's reputation persisted.
What was terribly worrying about was their response. The response was simply this: what is the church getting all worried and fussed about? This is fantasy. This is just a game. And I had to say, well, it may just be a fantasy game for you, but for the many families who live, for instance, in the city of Manchester, where families have lost their young people through gun crime, these sorts of computer games is not just a game.
And here's the Subdean.
Very sadly, Manchester is one of those cities that suffers with gun crime at a high level. We've had 3 shootings in the last, in fact 4, there was another one earlier last night in Oldham. And in a sense, I personally think it exacerbates the problem because it transforms a place of peace and worship and quiet that's used by thousands of people throughout the week into this battle scene, which I personally feel is rather grotesque and degrading.
The bishop said Sony couldn't have chosen a less appropriate setting.
Of all the cathedrals in the country, Manchester is the most inappropriate because we hold memorial services for people who have been killed by guns.
Insomniac was unaware of Manchester's gun problems, though Stephen disputes the assertion that video games are a catalyst for violence.
Gun violence is a terrible, senseless waste of life. I'm sorry if I offended anyone who was a victim of gun violence, either directly or indirectly, but I also don't believe that video games incite or instruct anyone how to commit violence, whether by firearm or any other way. I didn't use the cathedral, I took photos of the cathedral, and I made a digital interpretation of it that appeared in a work of science fiction. I disagree that this act was sick or sacrilegious, especially in the context of the fictional story we were telling. This game in no way takes away from the power of the church, denies its teaching, or desecrates any kind of hallowed space, let alone condones anyone to commit acts of murder within it.
In the multiplayer version of the Manchester map, bigger liberties were taken with the building's design. The nave has been awkwardly widened, a second partition added, and catwalks crisscross the roof space. This level was built by a different team, but it still features recognisable details and textures based on Stephen's photos of the cathedral. I think this multiplayer map is where the argument of insensitivity is hardest to dismiss. A representation of humans shooting and killing other humans inside a place of worship would be understandably offensive to those who work in that building, even if it is, ultimately, just a game. A week after the story first broke, after daily criticism in the media, Sony finally admitted the building was Manchester Cathedral. and faxed officials a grudging apology.
We do not accept that there is any connection between contemporary issues of 21st century Manchester and a work of science fiction in which a fictitious 1950s Britain is under attack by aliens. We believe a comprehensive viewing of the work will make its content and context clear. It was not our intention to cause offence by using a representation of Manchester Cathedral in Chapter 8 of the work. If we have done so, we sincerely apologise.
Sony's implication that the level had been taken out of context is echoed by Stephen Ratter.
Just about all of the games that I have made have a personal, historical, and meaningful context of what they're asking the player to do. The narrative and the context are my stock and trade. You always have to think about the context. I'm not making games condoning gun violence on a meaningless level, and I would hope that anyone playing a shooter, fictional or otherwise, would recognize gun violence has consequences in the real world. We are taught to love thy neighbor, not shoot thy neighbor, and in the main story mode campaign of resistance, the Manchester Cathedral had context.
3 weeks later, at their General Synod, the Church of England published their Sacred Digital Guidelines, a set of principles they hoped game companies would sign. The same day, in an ad in the Manchester Evening News, Sony apologised to the residents of Manchester. The church's upset was genuine, but they played their hand very well, using all their connections to apply pressure in the hope that Sony would relent. But it didn't happen. The game was neither withdrawn nor amended. Sony refused to sign up to the Sacred Digital Guidelines, and even the requested donation to local charities was never agreed to. The only thing the Cathedral got was an apology. And one other benefit. By their own admission, visitor numbers, particularly the young, rose in the aftermath. Sony, on the other hand, appeared to have been caught off guard. They were slow to communicate, their spokesperson wasn't properly briefed, and in the week that it took them to compose a meaningful response, the Cathedral controlled the story. A massive international corporation was outplayed by a Church of England diocese and its tiny communications team. But though they bore the brunt of the negative press, Sony sustained no real damage. There was no legal action, no organised boycott, and no admission of wrongdoing. And the publicity worked in their favour too, revitalising sales of the game several months after its release date. Real-world locations can make for memorable moments in games, but they can bring their own problems. As game worlds have become more realistic, the risks have increased, but today, companies are more mindful of the issues.
It's because of cases like the Manchester Cathedral that when making games now, imagery and locations are handled much differently and with much more consideration. If anything, this is a tale of the wild and woolly days when this type of copywriting and protection was much more up in the air, if they even existed.
Stephen Ratter has never told his story before. While at Insomniac, the rules of PR meant he couldn't defend his choices. But despite the many other games he's worked on, he's eager to set the story straight about Resistance Fall of Man. That the Cathedral level was not a decision made thoughtlessly, disrespectfully, or sacrilegiously. The truth, as always, is far more nuanced.
I'm hoping that if it meant something to someone, they would consider what is worth fighting for, why you would fight for that ideal, and make up their own mind, free of the opinions of any church, institution, or corporation.
Thank you to everyone who helped with this episode, but especially to Stephen Ratter for providing his memories, his photos, and his voice. His contributions are the backbone of this episode. And a big debt of gratitude is due to my supporters on Patreon, including these wonderful people on screen for chipping in as little as $1 to help make this video possible. If you liked it and want to help me out, you could check out the rewards on the Patreon, or you could share the link to this video with people you think would enjoy it. It really is a big help when people do that. There'll be more episodes on the way soon. If you want to know when they're posted, click subscribe. I'm Chris, and I'll see you again in the past.